I think the two things that come together are the seizure of the agenda inside the West and inside France, in particular by the New Left in the 1960s, leading to the May events of '68 and battles in the streets for who controlled the space, politically and socially, with tens of thousands of CRS riot squads battling with hippies and leftists in the centre of Paris, with 1 million people in the streets, far bigger than many of the Arab Spring demonstrations which have convulsed world media during the last 12 months, for example. De Gaulle's government tottering, the military talking about intervening, and it becoming so chaotic in France that the ordinary business of just living and governing in the big cities had somewhat ground to a halt. And the left had achieved this by radicalising the student base, by radicalising the politics of the baby boomer generation that had been born immediately after the devastation of the Second European Civil War, as I regard it, really, the Second World War between 1939 and 1945. And Grèce was a response to this, because it was felt that the old right was outmoded, could not appeal to people under 40, and there needed to be new thinking, basically. So you had all these forces in play, and the desire to create a new right was really the conception of two people, as far as I can see, looking from the outside, Alain de Benoist and Guillaume Faye, with some other people joining in from other countries, Marco Tarci from Italy, and Paul, I think it's Paul, isn't it, Krebs from Germany. And they're the names that stick out for me. There are many other people involved, and I think Grèce had at least about 8,000 members at one time, although it's dwindled subsequently, because it's largely achieved its theoretical task.
So, who are some of these thinkers? I mean, obviously Nietzsche and Carl Schmitt come to mind, but what is the constellation of thinkers that the New Right reinvented?
Yes, it's people like Georges Sorel, who was on the left as well as the right, people like Curzio Malaparte, who was on the left as well as the right. Going back into the Anglophone tradition, people like Thomas Carlyle, but above all, I suppose, Ernst Jünger, and the thinkers of what was known as the Conservative Revolution in Germany between the end of the Great War and about 1930. And these would be Carl Jung, not the analytical psychologist, but the thinker, Oswald Spengler, Roland van den Broek, Ernst Jünger and his brother, Franz von Solomon, Fritz or Franz, or is it Ernst von Solomon? And they're equivalents in other countries, sometimes they're lesser equivalents in other countries, including the then communist-occupied Eastern Europe and Russia. I also think there's another confluence, another strand that comes together in the New Right, and this is an attempt to get away from the fascistic right of the early part of the 20th century, and yet to steal its clothes and also to repackage it in various ways and to bring it up to date. And all of this, of course, was not original in that it had been done by the left, because the phenomenon of the New Left, which is quite an old New Left indeed, viewed now 50 years on, had been repackaged in the 1960s and early 1970s and straddled the left wing of social democratic and labour movements in Europe all the way out through moderate forms of Euro-communism in comparison to more mainstream prior forms of communism, and the old traditional left, going through ultimately at their farthest margins to terrorist and urban guerrilla groups that of course became quite active in Europe and very notorious in the 1970s. So you had this recasting of the left using anti-Stalinist ideas, non-Stalinist forms of leftism because Stalinism had become so embarrassing, various forms of Trotskyism, certain anarchist left-wing ideas and syndicalist ideas, certain ideas drawn from existentialism, which was presented as a humanism to court, and certain ideas that will become post-structuralism and deconstruction. These all sort of bubbled away in the New Left cauldron, together with the Frankfurt School Marxism, which sought to differentiate itself from Marxist-Leninism, but led straight to political communism. And Frankfurt School Marxism in all its complexity has played a major role in revamping all left and or would-be progressive thought in the last 50 to 70 years, and provides a continuum of thinking from liberal-minded people who are very moderate in left-wing terms, all the way through to the hardest reaches of the left. The Frankfurt School's influence can be seen subtly almost everywhere. Fiscal anti-Americanism, which is part of the French tradition, and it is part of the tradition of French politics, left, centre and right, and it's just there. There is a rivalry between France and the United States, irrespective of the revolutionary heritage. That is there. The security services spied on each other throughout much of the 20th century, even though they're nominal allies and so on. They fought together in most wars. But this tension culturally and nationally, despite the fact the United States is a much more powerful state confederation than France in its present form could ever be, is nonetheless there. And although de Beaumont has always sort of eschewed sort of crude French nationalism, there is a French nationalist and a chauvinist element to it, which is quite pronounced. But that is part of the continental attitude. I would always slightly deflect it by saying that there are many cultural figures in the United States that the New Right prizes, and if they were engaged in crude American baiting and burning of the American flag like left-wing students during the Vietnam War in Europe, in America and elsewhere, this wouldn't come across. And so a lot of the repositioning of people involves people like Ezra Pound, and involves people like T.S. Eliot to a lesser extent, and involves people like Jack London. And so they're very much aware of these figures in the United States who are anti-American in terms of the perceived ideology of what's regarded as Americanism abroad. One of the facts about all societies, of course, is that they're all ideological, but the people who live in them don't think they are. So the ordinary American would be amazed and even slightly appalled that there's such a thing as Americanism. But to people outside the United States, particularly those who feel they're on the brunt of the enormous power, the soft power America has in the marketplace and culturally, particularly at the mass level, it's the popular mass culture which traditional Europeans feel is so Americanized now in Europe, and also in Eastern Europe, post-communist to a degree. It's that they're reacting against. I would deny that they ever engaged in crude American baiting and anti-Americanism, although some of their imagery at their high point could come quite close to that. There's also the need for an enemy, and they wanted to redefine the enemy away from the traditional enemies of the old right, and the new enemy was global liberalism powered by America.
Let's move on to another very important issue about the New Right, and that is the pagan question. And one of Benoit's major books is entitled On Being a Pagan. And even though Fay might be a little more generous, let's say, towards Christianity, generally speaking, the New Right is not only a pagan, but a kind of anti-Christian movement. And they certainly see Christianity in a secularized and Americanized form as one of the chief enemies. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why they chose to do that. And that's certainly also a major break with the old right, which, in the French context was staunchly Catholic.
Yes, and still is to a large degree.
Right.
The traditionalist wing of the Front National, which may form a new party now that the Le Pen's daughter has taken the party leftwards and made it into a populist vehicle. It's sort of because she's changed the ideological orientation of the FN.
Right.
Under her father, Jean-Marie, it used to be a sort of neo-traditionalist organisation that was very much old right, although it used populist slogans and catchphrases and sought popular and mass appeal. It was essentially an old right traditional organisation with quite a lot of people in the leadership who were influenced by the New Right. That's what the New Right has had. It's had influence on people who are involved. which is in some ways a credit to its success. On the pagan point, it again comes back to its elitism. The view is that you must settle the ultimate questions first. It's a form of anti-politics in a way. When you ask a politician an awkward question, he always evades it. The thinking being that he must not offend people because everyone he offends is a prospective voter lost, and that's not how you do populist politics. But if you're doing anti-populist politics, or if you're doing elitist philosophical politics, you've got to decide what you believe metaphysically first, rather than pretend that you can be all things to all people at a later date.
True.
And so they look very hard at Western civilization. They believe that Christianity was dying slowly and was becoming a preserve of the older generations, even in Catholic countries where it still had a lot of kick. And they decided that if Europe was to be revived, you'd have to go right back to pre-Christian pagan antiquity and update many of the belief systems involved. And yet, what they've done, of course, is they've been extreme, because in a sense they are extremists. They're not moderates by nature. So they have deliberately targeted areas which are outside the comfort zone of most people who traditionally regarded themselves as right-wing. And they've done so philosophically rather than emotionally, although these things always have an emotional core to them. And they've done so in a considered manner, which is essentially Nietzschean, really. They thought that man needs a belief system. The ultimate questions of life and death have to be answered. The left can't answer them because it says that they can't be answered because they're not there. Atheism is impossible except for individuals, but it's not possible for the right. You have to confront the enormous swathe of people that believe in a creative force, a creative being, a supreme being. There's another reason why they adopted it, and that is because they reject conspiracy theory, and because they reject conspiratorial explanations of reality. You have to have process versions of reality, which are philosophical and dialectical, and those sit very well with pagan and with pre-Christian ideas. They regard conspiracy theory as Christian, ultimately, and as reductive, and as coming from Catholicism, their own supranational and yet somehow national religious tradition. So they're doing several things at once. They're rejecting Christianity, they're rejecting conspiracy theory, they're rejecting blaming the usual suspects for the whole of the modern world and for everything that you don't like about modernity. And they wanted to think out things again, using the rational and spiritual ideas of the ancient world that they believe are the core European values underneath everything. In some ways, it's a very rational critique. This is the thing about the New Right, that it's very rationalist, but not in an 18th century and Enlightenment way. It's rationalist in an ancient Greek way. Most of its arguments are not decibel arguments. They're actually quite refined, purist, ultra-European arguments. What Nietzsche tried to do at his best, even though there's a lot of emotional storm and stress and romanticism in Nietzsche's way of saying it. I think in relation to Christianity, they see the secularization which has occurred in Europe of Christianity and the existence of a seething Protestant evangelical Christianity alongside secularization in the United States as the outcome of tendencies that are pregnant within the religion itself.